This is Laura Sands, MP for Thanet, and I forget the next bit.
Well, Thanet, and it's sort of Sandwich, Ramsgate, Broadstairs, and Margate, which has a very strange sort of mixture of coastal town and quite a lot of the rural world as well.
And while she's looking for her own PowerPoint, which I should have done for her, Laura's newly elected, but actually comes out of defence analysis background, an academic, and is working in very, very interesting thinking. So I thought we should hear her.
Well, I come really from the point of view, as Tim says, as for a real interest in the whole issue of food security. I just happen to be a member of Parliament, okay? So when all those post-it notes go up on thing about government, don't send them round to my office. But I'm sure some of them I'd be very happy to take forward and discuss with ministers and through government departments.
Did you do your own?
Well, I've got mine
Sophie,
a little bit outlined
Sophie?
here. And this is very much from, my perspective. It has no party political sort of leaning to it. But my background really is sort of defence, but also energy security. And when you start to look at security, national security in its whole, I think for very many years, food has been really left off the agenda. Because governments and people, it's always been abundance. There isn't really an issue with food, is there? It's totally cheap. The market will deliver whenever there's an issue. There's a more interconnected world, so, if one country fails, we can procure from another. So, fantastically cheap food, very happy customers, rich retailers. Yes, we got some problems with farmers, but, we don't want to compromise the fact that we're delivering cheap food to people through supermarkets. So, now, I know you as academics have been very much involved in what really is behind this. But this has been, in some ways, the political background on which food has been regarded over many, many years. But we all know that the world is changing dramatically and that this is no longer the ability for us to say that food... Sorry, is it all very small? But you'll get a copy of these later. And as I said, my background really is security. So are we resilient to food insecurity? I think that we've really got to... I was just in Thailand a couple of months ago. We're talking about the whole of the Thai and Cambodian rice crop is being decimated, okay? Now, that's so distant, isn't it, from the UK? But as I've said in Parliament many times, what happens in the Horn of Africa or in Thailand actually impacts my constituents in the supermarket. And this is where I don't see any divide between the global agenda and the domestic. For me, it's the same. And in some ways, maybe you as a grouping should try and break those divisions down, because I think that they become, particularly in such a globalised market as food, I think we've got to really ensure that people make those connections. We've also got an issue about access. And when people talk about... I was talking to a very large producer who used to process food in the UK. They've moved all their processing to Africa, and their business model was that they would be importing into the UK 80% of that food. Now, because of the growth in consumption in Africa, they will be exporting to this country 20%. Now, that creates quite a change in business model. This is a very, very large producer. So when we're talking about competing markets, we're no longer this dominant importer. We're having to compete with a lot of other countries whose calorific intake is increasing, whose whole approach to food is changing. But we seem to be just going on as if there's nobody else in the world who's interested in the food sector. Price. Now, I think price is a very interesting issue because, to be frank, and keep this quiet, I think a little bit of an increase in food prices is really, really important. Really important. But what we can't be looking at is huge volatility and a massive increase in the price of food. In many ways, we've become deluded and maybe drunk on cheap food, but what we mustn't have is the volatility. And the volatility is very much fueled by energy costs, as we know. But one thing that I'm sort of talking quite extensively with, particularly the Ministry of Defence. Now, you'd think that was interesting, but the MOD is probably the non-DEFRA department, non-DFID department, that is most interested and understands food security more than any other department. And I'm sure, I don't know whether we've got anybody from the MOD here, but no?
Yeah.
Well, next conference, you should have some people from the MOD.
We've had people from the MOD at the last one.
Very, very interesting. And one of the big problems we've got globally is protectionism. With the incentives out of the 2008 price scare, price hike, was that protectionism works. Protectionism kept down domestic prices in the countries that imposed export bans. Now, that is an appalling lesson to have learned, and it creates a very, very much more volatile and difficult environment. So how are we globally putting in place, in some ways, capacity mechanisms? Regional capacity mechanisms. For example, Tanzania imposed an export ban in July. Where is that regional capacity mechanism that could help them not impose that export ban? Where there was a sort of storage supply, capacity to hedge their domestic vulnerabilities. And nobody can dismiss the fact that if you are a country, you're exporting food out of your port, and in your markets, prices are going through the roof. You can't do it politically. And strangely enough, in non-democratic countries, you find it even more difficult than democratic countries. So there's a very, very big political risk, which I'm sure we're all aware of. Domestic resilience, the perfect squeeze. You know, yields have not really gone up, costs have gone up for the consumer, but where are the rewards for the producer? Access to staples, as I said, people who are producing staples, and now a lot of it is being consumed within their domestic market. So we're going to get what I call, a food crunch. It's like a credit crunch where we're not going to necessarily be able to access food in quite the same way, or certainly at the same price. Procurement. I'm sure many of you know there was a report by Lord Cameron in the House of Lords that said we're 9 meals away from a food crisis. So just in time is unbelievably efficient, and it delivers fantastically cheap food. But it is not at all resilient. And resilience, in many ways, is what security, one element of the security agenda is. And so this very efficient supply chain is vulnerable. Waste, I'm sure we've got people from RAP here and people who do a lot of work on waste. That is just a massive issue. And I've got farmers who are ploughing food back into their fields because it's not of the right size. I was at an apple farm on Friday, and they were saying that they are getting rid of apples that were totally delicious and beautiful, a little bit of a scarring or not the right colour, for £80 a tonne of apples. It's literally disgusting, actually. That's the only word you can use for it. So we need to look at this through the whole supply chain. And if any of you are really sad enough to look at an adjournment debate that I had with Jim Pace about 4 or 5 months ago, I said that actually what we should do, and maybe we could do this here collectively, set up a company called Ugly Foods. Seriously, I mean, it is just appalling when you see people starving around the world, and we are worried about the colour of an apple, whether it's pink enough on one side and green enough on the other. So we need to change our behaviour. We need the supermarkets and the whole procurement process to change the behaviour. And I would say to you, it is very, very much easier for governments to pass legislation. A lot of the agenda around food is about behaviour, and all I can say is that doesn't come in a pre-packaged bill going through Parliament. That is a much, much bigger thing, and we've got a lot of a lot of years of, in some ways, bad behaviour, not understanding food, not valuing it, that we have to overcome. I think you all know we are very, very vulnerable to international imports, and we're one of the highest consumers of processed food. And I think that's, again, a very much a behavioural thing. I'm, like previous speaker, very concerned about biofuel policy, and I think we need to look at that quite seriously. But, you know, to be frank, why should government act? This is all about a market. This market works up to a point. Okay, so food prices go up, go down. And yes, you talk to DEFRA or you talk to DFID. Now, I'm trying very hard to change this agenda, not away from DEFRA and DFID, but in parallel to say that this is much more of a strategic issue than just a production and consumption issue. This is a treasury issue. Now, anybody who knows about government knows that if you get to the Treasury, then things happen. If you talk to the other departments, they've got to go to the Treasury. And why is it absolutely crucial for the UK and the UK economy? Last year, we're talking 6% increase in food inflation. Right? Now, that eats into disposable incomes, undermines growth, creates volatility in households, and as a result of commodity price rises, the indicator for benefits rise has gone to 5.2%. So issues to do with food volatility, issues to do with food security impact the Treasury absolutely where it hurts. As we said, we're more vulnerable to global markets, so the solution isn't just domestic, the solution is cross-departmental. And very much what David was saying, this is very much an integrated approach that needs to be looked at. Low-income households, very, very important. We're talking about 50% of disposable income is spent on food, and every time you get a percentage rise, that increases. And the Bank of England is also indicating that there are some major issues with commodity price rises. And that will also, they say, more than any other aspect of spending, food price rises goes straight to the consumer in the quickest period of time. So it's a very immediate reaction. The food industry is very concerned about food security, access to supply, issues to do with how they're going to, how consumers are going to look at affordability. And so this is something that absolutely everybody within the production, supply, academic world share as an issue. And then we've got the issue of fuel poverty, political tension, benefits rise, which I think is absolutely crucial. So while we're talking about food security in our language, I think it's also extremely important to talk about it in a broader language, open it up to other departments to ensure that they understand that food security is actually at the heart of both our economic and, in many ways, social security. I will not go through this, but I will leave this with you, and maybe some of the questions, some of your stickers might highlight some of these issues or not, and I'd be fascinated to see what comes out of it. But I think we need a food security refit, and that is about different departments taking on different elements. I don't think if you end up with this totally focused around DEFRA, I think one's going to lose the agenda. I think we need to have food security obligations within departments. And so DFID has actually been steering away from agriculture a bit, needs to come back into that. Also, international issues like the WTO. If you're going to join the WTO, is it linked up with UNDP on infrastructure and storage and agricultural so-called underpinning? Are all these different organisations really working together? So that's an FCO sort of perspective. DEFRA, as I say, really needs to look at the wider issue of food security obligations. And you can see all these things that we've actually covered earlier. But there's a big role for DEFRA, but not solely. Biz. I go around to my schools and I say to them, and I'm in an agricultural area with some fishermen as well, and I go and talk to them and say, So, how many of your young people are going into food science, food production? Whatever? Oh, well, we don't want them picking, beans out of fields. That is the perception in the secondary sector about what going into food is about. And that is actually a job of many people in this room. Yeah. And it's not just in academic institutes. You've got to go and talk to schools. You've got to go and talk to head teachers. Food is a very sexy business to be in. It's a very exciting opportunity for young people. And I don't think that we're doing nearly enough. And I would put that challenge to you to talk to at least 2 or 3 head teachers before your next symposium about how exciting this sector is for young people. There's actually been an announcement about a fund for innovation, I think in the last couple of weeks, from beers into the food sector. Curriculum changes. Again, this is education, and that is absolutely crucial. We have lost that home economics, that food linkage through our education system, and that needs to be relinked. And so one wonderful lady here who's American was telling me that in the States you used to have be a farm. What's it? Somebody here who said new farmers or be a farmer? Future farmers. Sorry? Future farmers. And that was for everybody, including people who live in urban areas. We need to connect back to where our food comes from. And I think future farmers is a really, really exciting idea, and I will take that back. Thank you very much. And also, we've got to look at the nutritional deficit. These are the 4 areas that I think are important: security of supply, demand waste, affordability and volatility, and efficiency in production. And if we can get some policies around that, pulling that together across different departments, I think we're going to be in a much better place. Now, I know Tim wants me to stop immediately. This is just my last slide, which is about the energy sector and the food and agronomy sector. On the left, this is what we're doing as a government in terms of energy security. On the right is a potential translation into the food sector. If we look at food in the same way as, or put the same emphasis that we're putting on when it comes to energy, there are mechanisms there. There is the equivalent of the Green Deal. There is the equivalent of greater domestic production, sustainability, which is absolutely crucial and at the heart of energy policy, but certainly should be at the heart of our agricultural policy. I think it's a very exciting time, and I'm not quite as downbeat about what this government might hopefully do in the future on food security. I think that there is a great impetus behind it. All I would say to you is always get your message across in a way that the Treasury understand. Thank you very much. Thank you.